decisions. Okay, I'm going to record it. Okay, welcome everybody again. Rabbi Julie Hilton-Denon here for Seaside Jewish Community's Rabbi Seminar of 2025. And we're in the second class of these monthly classes. And I'm so glad to see a lot of you decide to come back after the first class. It's which is this year we were learning about Jewish views of Jews in search of God, I think, in the modern era, because previously we had learned about how Jews described and looked for God in the classical periods, the Bible, Talmud, and in Maimonides and the Rationalists and the mystics and Kabbalah and so on. So I wanted to ask you, though, before we got started, if there was anything like from the last class, either you had a question about, or was there something in the last class that kind of stayed with you and made you see things a little differently? Anything you remember a month later?
Remember anything 5 minutes later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, think about it. Yes,
Yeah.
Elsa.
Am I on? Let's see. Okay. Yeah, the thing that actually struck me the most was the discussion we had at the very beginning when you were talking about that Judaism necessarily didn't have to be about God or religion, because I was remembering that when I was a little girl, well, actually, both of my grandmas, but my maternal grandma was very Orthodox. I remember I used to spend Shabbos with her, etc. And she did like everything by the book. And
Yeah.
years later now, she's gone many years, but in discussing with my cousin, she said she had apparently expressed some doubts, but she had done all those things for so many decades. She didn't want to like lose credit, just in case there really was a God. And and I was stunned to hear that, because I just assumed that being a religious person, she believed, and you had said at that class that there wasn't necessarily the belief in God. It could be separate from Judaism. So that actually just struck me.
Yeah, that's very important, and thank you for sharing that. I was talking about, Kaplan. Actually, we're going to come to Kaplan, back to Kaplan, with believing, belonging, and either becoming or doing. And also, we don't define you being Jewish by your beliefs, as you might for Christianity. Like you believe something to be Christian, right? And to be Jewish, really, you're born Jewish, you convert to Judaism, you could say you're a devout Jew, a practicing Jew, a cultural Jew, but that doesn't necessarily define you as a Jew. And even among, I think it's interesting that you say that she was like orthoprax. She did the practice of being Orthodox, even if she wasn't sure about her beliefs. And I think it's much more common than you would think, because if you grow up in that community, I mean, I've just read different things that people grow up that way. That's their family, their community. And that doesn't mean that some are spiritual and devout, some less so, and some have doubts and all kinds of things like that. So that's interesting. And I think one of the things I hope people took with them was this idea of the metaphorical language that we use to talk about God, right? That we can't say exactly God is this, but more like God is like this, and so kind of like this, and we could be a little creative with those metaphors that we choose. And also that we don't need to think of God as a giant being in the sky, or so. I know it's not, we don't think of maybe that crudely, but as a super powerful being, we've acquired some beliefs of omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and we'll see that there's been different ideas about God. So, okay, so with that, let me bring up my favorite thing, PowerPoint. Oh, what is happening? It says I'm screen sharing, but why does it? There we go. All right, hopefully this will work. Yay. Okay, so we're in Jews in Search of God in the Modern World. And this class is about rationalism. So, I'm trying to get the hard stuff out of the way first. Hard for me. I'm not being very
What is
rational.
that? What was that a photograph of? The
This is
previous
by the
slide?
way, the first one is a
Yeah.
photograph of reflections it's in a creek that was actually in New York. That's actually the reflections. And this is autumn trees, just the reflections at the golden hour in this pond and this little lake in New York State. And so we'll look
wow.
at some manifestations of rationalism. And I really got this framework from Neil Gaiman in his book, which I think at least one person's reading. And if anyone else got the book or any of the books, you put it in the chat if you're reading any of the books and you like them. His is a little more of the heavy book, but he's written some other books also that are a little more accessible. But he really made those categories. He's also a rabbi. Professor Neil Gaiman also made these categories that I've borrowed of rationalism, empiricism / experientialism, mysticism, and existentialism as 3 categories of modern Jewish thought. And I'm going to kind of give it my own twist by saying, well, how could I relate to that? I think that rationalism in modern Jewish thought may be the less common path to theology, but we'll see. So we'll look at some of the classic proofs for God. We'll look at Mordecai Kaplan's non-supernatural theology of the Reconstructionist movement. We'll see what some Jewish scientists think about God, and then we'll see Neil Gaiman's, if we have time, we'll look at some of Neil Gaiman's personal theology, but if we don't, we can come back to it later. So let's say I didn't really do a little nigun today, but maybe a little just Hine Ma Tov, and then we'll say the blessing. Hine Ma Tov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine Ma Tov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine Ma Tov shevet achim gam yachad. Hine Ma Tov shevet achim gam yachad. הנה מה טוב ומנעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב ומנעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר קידשנו במצוותיו וציוונו לעסוק בדברי Torah. Holy One, a blessing, your presence fills creation. You made us holy with mitzvot and bid us to engage with words of Torah. So again, these 3 categories that we're going to use for looking at the way Jews look at God in the modern era, which I did take from Neil Gaiman, but I made up my own descriptions of them. So first of all, the rationalist, and I call that God makes sense. A great exemplar could be Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan. The empiricist or the experientialist would be more like I sense God. And the most notable, this kind of big 3 of 20th century Jewish philosophy or Jewish theology, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. That'll be coming, I think, next class. And then religious existentialism. My life makes sense because of God. And we'll see Martin Buber. We'll see maybe Harold Schulweis, Harold Kushner, some other ones. And of course, don't forget that not all Jews believe in God, and we all circle through these different beliefs at different times. And I think there's not too many people that just have like a pure outlook that's one of these, but they might exhibit a lot of, a tendency to really connect to one of those categories. So the first thing is being like proofs of God's existence. And I know I have a real, Larry Stoller here is really into philosophy, so he probably could do this a lot better than me. Yeah, maybe you'll help us out. But I know there's been different proofs made, and it's important to say that traditionally, like if you go back to the Bible or even the Talmud, first of all, the Talmud doesn't have a very systematic theology, unlike a lot of the early church fathers who were, they had doctrines and dogmas, and the rabbis were, this one thought this way, this one thought that way. They disagreed, they argued, very Jewish, right? And it was really under the influence of becoming in touch with some of the other, well, first with Greek thought, like Philo of Alexandria, who's a Jewish philosopher, like in the Hellenistic period, but he wasn't really seen as like a mainstream Jewish guy. But today we study him. He's interesting. And then really in the Middle Ages, as the Islamic world rediscovered and shared, the Greek, the Greek philosophers, it became very Jews. This came to Jews too. Jews learned about it. Jews began to embrace this kind of theology. And they also thought they had to kind of compete with the Christians and the Muslims who had these expressions of their creed and their dogma and their proofs of why their religion was right. So the Jews began to do that too, like in the Gaonic period, Saja Gaon, in like 9th century Babylonia, and then of course, Maimonides is probably the prime example, who lived in Morocco, then, Spain, then Morocco, then Egypt, briefly in the Holy Land. Yeah, and Larry, feel free to jump in if I'm, totally making philosophy salad here or something.
Will do. No,
Okay.
so far so good.
All right. Well, let's take a look then at there's been many proofs, so to speak, for God, and they're not as popular today. I mean, people don't usually do this today, but at the same time, when people say, I don't believe in God, right? When people say, I just can't believe, it's often in thinking in these terms of like, these arguments don't make sense to me. That like, if there's a God who's an all-powerful, invisible figure looking at us all the time, how do I prove that or disprove it? Well, so Gilman actually shared 3 of the most popular of many arguments for God. And they have been argued, they've been proven, they've been disproven. Some of them are still kind of used, especially the last one. But let's take a look at them. Well, actually, Larry, I'll let you read it because you can read it and then you can add anything that you want. By the way, he did not prepare for this. I just calling on him because I know he teaches about this a lot. Okay. Unmute yourself, though. Yeah.
Done.
Okay. So could you read this for us? 3 classical proofs of God's existence.
Sure.
Okay.
The ontological argument, the very idea of God exists by definition, a being than which nothing greater can be thought. The cosmological argument, every change in the world is caused by another, but behind the entire chain of causation, there must be an unmoved mover, that is God. It must be beyond matter and is pure thought and thinking, and Maimonides, Jewish exemplar. And the teleological argument, the argument from design that creation points to creator. Early Jewish philosophers such as Philo, Bachya, and Yehuda Halevi.
Yeah, keep going.
Continue? Okay,
Yeah.
Philosophical proofs for God were unknown in early Judaism and most popular in the Middle Ages, but still have some appeal today. Each of these has its problems. Can you name some? But all point to a desire for our pursuit of theology to have a rational basis.
Okay. So let's unpack those a little bit. So that saying I had of a being than which nothing greater can be thought came from the Christian world, from Saint Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury, died 1109. But this was, and this ontological argument for God was not the most popular in the Jewish world, but it has been a popular one in classical, philosophy and theology, and that's called the a priori ontological argument. Essentially, it's an attempt to prove the existence of God from the very idea or definition of God. In other words, because you can't think of anything bigger than God, and you can't think of anything greater than that. You can think of that, and just because you can conceive of it, he exists. It exists. It's very hard for me to define this. I find this confusing. I don't know if anybody else has heard of this and can give us a better definition of it. David Hirschler, you're kind of nodding. Do you have any thoughts about it? Okay. Okay. Well,
Well,
anyway, yes,
a
yes,
million years ago,
yes, please tell us where you
I
learned a million years ago.
studied Wittgenstein, who actually was trying to figure out what the essence of things were, and
Mhm.
he went through and tried to. He wrote a work, and then the long and the short of it is he actually came to the realization that metaphors are the only thing that can actually define stuff. That what I say isn't what you understand each and every time. And what it is, what we're each talking about is pretty unknowable. So after he died, his assistant put together something called Philosophical Investigations, which were just scraps that he had collected over the years that were things like rabbits or ducks, this kind of a thing, a rabbit or a duck, depending on how you look at
Okay.
it. And it was all to
Oh, I
try
see.
to
Okay.
at what it actually was in a way that was beyond words. So
That
that's
was late Wittgenstein that you're describing.
that was after he had died. Yes.
Yeah, early Wittgenstein, and he changed his mind on this, started with what was called the picture theory, that language creates pictures in our head,
Yeah.
and we have enough in common. We have through our own logic and observation, the ability to kind of understand each other's pictures, but no two people ever hold the same picture.
That's great. Well, something to really study. But what about how that relate to God, then, Pamela?
Well,
Or what?
Wittgenstein discovered God under unusual circumstances. He oscillated, but during World War I, he was in the trenches with the Austrian army, and he couldn't do philosophy. And he needed something to help him carry on. And he worked out an idea of God, but it was never a very stable idea.
Okay. Well,
Um,
yeah. Well, Pamela, did you have something? I mean, what made you think of that when I brought this ontological argument up?
Well, I think of an ontological argument as basically saying it is because it is, which was
Yes, I think
what
that's what it is saying.
well, and what Wittgenstein was saying is that it isn't what it is, and that we can
Oh,
actually
oh my
get to
goodness.
that. So
Okay.
that was the point there.
Okay. Well, that's why I'm not a philosopher. I guess but I'm trying. I'm trying to understand the philosophical side, and I appreciate that. And I think that's a really fascinating idea because we all see and describe things in different ways. And this idea of using metaphors again is very germane to what we're talking about with theology, right? So,
Rabbi, what would you,
yes.
in the sense that, what would you do with it? I mean, it occurs to me that whether or not it's a good description of God or not, it's not very important in the sense that I can't imagine how you do anything with it. You certainly can't pray to it. You can't organize a around it. I don't think you can organize a religion around it, actually. So, I mean,
Yeah.
it's an interesting, what I would call a philosophical exercise, and I'm not putting it down. Certainly, Lichtenstein's a much greater thinker than I am. But I'm just curious about how you would work with it.
Well, I'm not sure, but I'll just say that from what I understand, Jewish theologians were not that excited about this ontological argument for God, that just because you can't think of anything greater, and this is the definition of God that we have, we can agree on it, therefore it is this. It's kind of circular reasoning. That's one of the objections. And it wasn't, it was just very foreign to their way of the Torah way of thinking. All these things, not just when you're saying, how can you pray to that God? For Jews, there would be other questions like, how does that God command? How does that God reveal? How does that God redeem? How does that God make a covenant with you? Right. So those are all different things that come more in Jewish philosophy.
Yeah, that's kind of my point.
Yeah, so we could go to the next one, which was more popular with Maimonides. And Maimonides was kind of an outlier, being more of a rationalist philosopher who thought that, our thinking faculty that's what really makes us divine, human and divine. And the person who can conceive of God more with reason, is the person who's really closer to God. And of course, one of my professors at the University of Texas, Rabbi Harold Leibowitz, said one of the problems with that is, of course, it's saying that the smartest people are, the best, and somebody who's maybe doesn't have as high of an IQ, but they're a good person, doesn't have, this special place that Maimonides. That's the way Maimonides saw things, though. So basically, this cosmological argument is that if you look at everything in the world, that there's a cause for everything, like, everything that happens, there's sort of a chain of actions. And at some point, back at I don't know, today we'd say maybe back at the Big Bang, something had to cause it all. And that's the definition of God, like the unmoved mover. That would be, right? We're talking Greek philosophy, like Aristotle. And so, sorry, and who wants to share? There's somebody want to unmute yourself and share? Anybody else? Jeff, did you want to share? Okay. All right. And then it doesn't mean that God is a physical body, but in fact, it's through thought. And maybe today some physicists would say through consciousness that God creates. And so again, for Maimonides, this thinking faculty is the most important thing because it's the most godlike. And I've got something in the chat that says, a few years ago, science announced a God molecule, which apparently is energy or is energy. Yeah. Well, we'll come back to that later too, to the quarks and the Higgs boson. Okay, we'll come back to that a little bit. And finally, there's a teleological argument, which is like the argument by design that there's, because there's this natural world that has some kind of purpose or order, it's just so amazing, that leads us to posit a creator. Like the way I've described it is if I went down to the beach and I saw like 3 rocks are piled on each other, I would probably think maybe somebody or some creature put them like that, right? I would immediately think that somebody made that. But all the more so if I see like a whole house is built, I would definitely go, well, that didn't just happen by accident. That wasn't a bunch of monkeys typing on keyboards for all eternity and then they became Shakespeare. It's like, right? What by looking at the wonders of creation and the amazing intricacies of the universe, you say there's got to be like a consciousness behind it. There's got to be a greater mind behind it or a creator behind it. So those are those 3 arguments. Like one is kind of like, just because there is such a concept, it's like there is a triangle. That's that's how you describe it. It is by definition what it is, which is a little hard to understand for me anyway. That ontological argument. Then you have cosmological. There had to be some cause behind all the other causes, and that does make God a little more distant, right? Transcendent, as I think Stan was saying, like, how do you relate to a God like that, the unmoved mover? I mean, when we pray the Amida, I think that I really think Heschel said this. You don't pray like to the God of Aristotle. You're praying to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's a relationship there, so it's a little distant for Jews. But this idea of the creator, that's something, you could get out of the Torah. God creates the world, and whether you think it happened literally like it says in the Torah, you look in awe at the universe and you see a creator. So what could be some of the problems with any of these arguments?
Let me throw out one concept and a question of how you would locate, or how we would locate, the concept of Ein Sof from Kabbalah, the Kabbalistic concept of God's the unlimited ultimate state, the unmanifested pre-creation state of God.
Yes.
And is that ontological as a concept? It is pre-creation. It has no material or causal element to the concept. Now, it wasn't very widespread, but it certainly is a core concept in Kabbalah.
Well, right, I don't know how to relate it to philosophy. I mean, but this kind of, I mean, I think we learned a little bit about that the first time we were looking at Jewish ideas about God, that there's, I mean, part of the meaning of Ein Sof is also I mean, sometimes we describe it like this boundless light, but it's kind of like this boundless no thingness.
Right.
Right? Ein is nothing in a way. And it's the I don't know, like what we would say is the analogous thing, like the dark energy or something like that. There's something out there, there's something behind everything that we can't grasp, but that has to come down in different channels into our world. And then the Kabbalists have a whole idea of how that
Through
happens and
the
what all these
Spirot.
Spirot are, but that's
Yeah.
not for tonight. But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but those could fit. So what about the argument by design? What's the problem with that? When you look at the amazing world and you're studying it and you say there has to be a creator, I mean, you could say I believe in evolution, but maybe God set that in motion. Any thoughts about that? What's the problems in looking at that as a proof of God?
Well, if there was a God, there wouldn't be a Donald Trump.
Well, okay, I don't really want to get into political things because obviously there isn't. God created everybody, even the ones you might not approve of. But there's definitely, we could say, though, if there's a God, like, why is there chaos? I mean, because if God is creating order and design, but the world is also full of things that are, I mean, that's going to be something we'll look at later as we look at this idea of God and a theodicy, trying to understand how there can be evil in a world with a good God who's all powerful and designing this beautiful world as we want to believe. So,
Well, how does that relate to the idea of God as the watchmaker? You know, God creates the watch and then
right,
the
right,
tick.
right. That's deism, right? It's
Right.
deism,
Yeah, I
which
mean,
is
that's sort of but it starts with the idea that God created the world. I mean, it starts with the idea that
yes,
everything in the
right,
world was created by God. But after that,
yeah, right,
God has a very passive role
right.
in that view.
Well, I think that's interesting, and that was, as I understand again from my limited knowledge in this particular field, that a lot of our founding fathers of the United States, some of them were deists, and this idea that God is like the watchmaker who's made the watch, and then it just
Right.
keeps running and ticking forever. But that was not popular in Judaism. Why? Well, what do you think? Why doesn't that fit in with a Jewish point of view?
Well, it did because it's contrary to our whole historical view of the covenant and the
Right,
getting us out of Egypt. Yeah, I mean, it's completely.
right,
I mean, that's one of the problems that Kaplan had with his view that
right.
God doesn't get involved in history. It negates, and I don't know if that's the right word, but it's contradicting the whole Jewish narrative. The whole Jewish narrative is
Yeah.
based on a God relationship between us and the covenant and God acting, for
Yeah,
whatever.
right. So I think you're answering your
Completely
own question,
antithetical
right?
to
Yeah,
it's completely antithetical to normative
right.
justice.
I think, yeah, definitely you're answering your own question very well, that we have this, and we'll see this also in Gilman, that there are these Jewish metaphors and Jewish myths, if you want to say, like patterns that we see in our world, and they come through Jewish tradition. And whether or not we agree or accept all of them, they're things that we have inherited and we kind of have to grapple with. And they all involve this idea of God being very active, being active in history, caring, being anthropothetic, as I think that's what Heschel's term is, having human-like, not physical characteristics, but emotional characteristics. That would not be the Ein Sof, by the way, who doesn't, for the Ein Sof, yes, doesn't really care. It's like the sun, get too close, you'll just burn up. But for this God who's like the Shekhinah, the immanent God who's with us, dwelling within us, she's crying about us, she cares. And or the Kadosh Baruch Hu is joyful and laughing for us, the Holy One, blessed be He. So I think, yes, this whole idea of just a distant God wouldn't be a very popular Jewish idea. And yet it is, it could be popular with some modern Jews who's like, I can believe in that. I just can't believe in all that other stuff,
Again,
yeah.
the Kabbalists address
Yeah.
this.
Yes.
Lurianic, I forget which school.
Yes.
The notion of tzimtzum,
Right.
of God compacting himself, of
Yeah.
distancing
Yes.
from our world, and that our job, or the Kabbalist view,
Yeah.
was to restore
Yeah.
the Shekhinah and the sparks and all of that. So there's sort of that watchmaker, or at least that reduction of involvement in human
Right. That's true.
day-to-day
There's a classic
history.
idea of God is making space for us to choose. And that has led to a lot of problems. But if it didn't happen, we wouldn't be here at all. So you have to kind of take both
Yeah.
sides of it. And I think we'll circle back to that when we look at the theodicy. But anyway, I think I've gotten us through my humble elementary understanding of these proofs of God. So now I can go into something more fun about the rational thoughts of God. And that is a Jewish, you could say a rationalist thinker, Mordecai Kaplan, who is the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. And he wasn't a pure rationalist. That's very hard to say that anybody was a pure rationalist or a pure this or that, but definitely his theology seems to be based on something that's not supernatural, that's acceptable to modern people in the 20th century in the United States, and is not in conflict with science and so on. So Mordecai Kaplan lived to be like 102. He was 1881 to 1983. I mean, kind of the joke was that he lived so long because he didn't want to go to heaven and find out there really is a supernatural God. He put it off. But anyway, I kind of wished we had Jackie Land. Jackie's not here, is she? No. She's been watching this, at least the video. So Jackie, if you're watching this, hi, because she's been very, very involved as a leader in the Reconstructionist movement and could have a lot to say about that. And I think the Newmans, maybe some other people are here, have been. And I was for a while leading a Reconstructionist congregation when I was in Texas. We joined the Reconstructionist movement. Now it's called Reconstructing Judaism. And it is based in near where near my places I go in Philadelphia. Anyway, so Kaplan was, somebody want to read this to us about Kaplan and the Jewish Reconstructionist movement?
He lived from 1881 to 1983. He was the founder of the Jewish Reconstructionist movement.
Yes.
Kaplan was profoundly influenced by the new social science of sociology and recent progress in the physical sciences. He came to see Judaism not as a religion, but as a civilization, characterized not only by beliefs and practices, but by language, culture, literature, ethics, art, history, social organization, symbols, and customs. He promoted the notion of a synagogue center, which offered not only religious prayer services, but study programs, drama, dance, song, sports, and exercise. From the Jewish.
Okay, doesn't that sound a little bit like Seaside? I don't know how much exercise we get. We do some.
Yes, yes,
We
yes,
have
it
the
does. Because,
Oy Vey 5K. We have the walking group, right?
yes, it does. But for Seaside, I think part of it, at least,
Yeah,
is the practical reason. We're the only game
right,
in town, and therefore we have to be more than just a house of worship.
right. Well, that's how he saw the synagogue, which, has three names in Jewish thought: the Bet Knesset, the gathering place. So that's what it is. Bet Midrash, place to learn Torah, and Bet Tefillah, place to pray. It's not only for praying, but it's also for all those cultural, civilizational activities that we could do. So anyway, and he was influenced by John Dewey, other American pragmatist thinkers. And I was reading something fascinating, like during the Depression, he really everyone had all these financial problems. So as his synagogue, and he entered like an essay contest that was run by the founder of Sears Roebuck, a Jewish guy, and that he won. And this became his, some of his great works about that become the founding of the Reconstructionist movement at some point. And he actually grew up in he came from Lithuania, then as a child came to the United States. He what came from first from this Orthodox world and was involved with like the modern Orthodox world, but then he went to the Jewish Theological Seminary, which was at one point Orthodox, but became conservative, right? And then even though he's conservative, he really started a new movement, Reconstructionism, but he didn't really see that say it was going to be a separate movement, but it did become a separate movement. All right, so let's look at some of his core. But first of all, actually, before I do this, how many people here have actually been in a Reconstructionist community or part of a Reconstructionist community? So
we were
okay.
we were very active in the Reconstruction, in the Reconstructionist movement. It's
Right.
interesting. Kaplan himself
Yes.
was Orthodox. I don't know if you knew that. His own practice was Orthodox. I
Or
mean,
orthoprax is what we were saying.
yeah, right. And he originally wanted to call. It wasn't the movement actually, but he originally wanted to call Reconstruction American Judaism, and that
Right.
says a lot because one of his ideas was to Americanize Judaism, but not to do what the Reform movement did. But
Yes.
he said that he didn't. The reason he didn't do it is because it gave the impression that the other denominations or the other philosophies he wanted were anti-American. So
Okay.
he
Okay.
jettisoned.
All right. Thank you.
He was kicked out of the Jewish Theological.
No,
Wait,
well,
who's saying? Carol's talking there. Okay,
Yeah.
Carol Newman. Kicked
Yeah,
out
he
of
was
what?
kicked out.
Oh, yes, he was. I was reading that. They kind of erased him from the Young Israel history. And also, well, he had prayer books that took out the mention of the chosen people, and some of his prayer books were burned, I'm told, by some Orthodox people that didn't like him. He was very controversial. Of course, now his ideas have become very much integrated into the larger Jewish community. Leslie Newman, what do you want to tell us about Reconstruction?
I was going to just make two comments.
Yes,
Number
please.
one, when Marilyn Feldman and I were interviewing people for Bus with strategic planning,
Yes.
one of the things we interviewed somebody who was very active in the Reconstructionist movement.
Okay.
And he pointed out that what we as Seaside are evolving to
Yes.
is also pretty common across the country, and particularly in smaller communities in more isolated areas that we're not as unique as we think we are. But the other thing that there is a Reconstructionist synagogue in Newark, Delaware.
Right.
And one of the things that I always thought differentiated them from other practices is they made their decisions based upon a vote of the congregation. So it wasn't the rabbi said or the board said, but if they were deciding what to do, they put it up to a vote. And if you're looking at something that is more American, given what our history is supposed to be around democracy, it would make a lot of sense. So I don't know how that fits in, but
well, that's interesting because I know that led to some struggles later on as they started, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. They trained rabbis who then went to school for like 5 years, come out as a rabbi, and they wanted to have some kind of authority and not just be like another member of the synagogue. And they had to kind of, I think, renegotiate that somewhat. But this idea that he really had the idea that he says, I use this a lot in Jewish history classes or classes basically about basic Judaism, I like to use his definition of Judaism as the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people, because each one of those words is important. It's evolving, it's not static. It's a civilization, not just a religion. It's all those aspects of a civilization, but it still has the religious, kind of basis to it. And then it's of the Jewish people, that it comes from the people and not from like a supernatural outside force, right? And that people, in fact, are creating their way of life and their folk way. So he saw that in more anthropological terms, I think. Anybody else here is either grew up Reconstructionist, has been a member of Reconstructionists? Okay, Evie, David?
That's called Mora D'Atra. And our congregation in Greenbelt was interesting because when they took a vote of which way to go, the congregation was literally split 50-50 between conservative and Reconstructionists.
Okay.
Even though the rabbis that we had for several rabbis were all came from RC, from the Reconstructionist College.
Yeah.
And we used the conservative prayer book for the longest time. I think they finally have shifted over.
Oh, no, a long time ago, they went for the silver method.
Everything is now straight Reconstruction.
Well, they still do.
Yeah.
And by the way, it is a duly affiliated congregation.
Which congregation is this? Sorry. What's the name of it?
It has a schizophrenic aspect to it. One reason.
What's the name of it?
Mishkan Torah.
Okay. Greenbelt.
Greenbelt, Maryland. But it's duly affiliated. It pays half dues to both movements.
Okay. So that's very interesting. I appreciate hearing that. And just going to change my view here. Yeah, well, what you're saying, the Mara Da'atra, that's Aramaic for like, you're like the rabbi of the place. And in the conservative movement, you make the ultimate like decisions about ritual and policies and things like that. So, but let's see some of the things that Kaplan said. So we'll look at a summary of some of his beliefs. That's really what I came here for. So let's go to this. All right. Oh, wait a minute. I got that out of order. All right, here we go. Kaplan's theology. So, first of all, his idea, which I just said, that Judaism is the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. And God for him, that's what I really want to share, because we're here to talk about how Jews see God, right? That God is not a supernatural being or even a being at all, but God is the power that makes for salvation. But again, it sounds almost like may the force be with you, but it's also like a power that's inside of everything, right? That makes for salvation. But what is salvation? Because when you hear salvation, I don't know. What do you think when I say the word salvation without reading what I wrote there? What would you think it means? Anybody? Or
well, it means you think of Christianity and
I do. I think of it as a Christian term, right? Saving your soul.
Yeah, but that's not what Kaplan.
And Jewish tradition, it's like Geulah. It's kind of like redemption, saving the people, bringing about the Messiah. You could say that, but for him, that's not what it meant. But it meant this worldly, humanistic process of self-fulfillment and integration achieved through the pursuit of ideals that foster peace and justice, rather than a supernatural world or a reward or escape from suffering. Close parentheses. And he had this non-supernatural theology that you don't have to go outside the natural world to find God. Now, I think if you take Larry's, Stoller's going to do a class about some of the thinkers like Spinoza, who he was before his time, so he wasn't well accepted, but he had a kind of pantheistic view of God being just immanent in nature. So Kaplan has that, but still, it's a dynamic idea that God is actually, there's a pattern of a destiny sort of salvation. And, he was formulating this early in the 20th century before some of the things that happened that maybe weren't so salvific in the world. And yet he still adhered to this belief. He said belonging comes before believing. In other words, we belong to the people, the Jewish people. That's really what makes us Jewish, and the belief is secondary to that. Somebody else want to read a little bit, starting from To Believe in God? Carol, Ash?
Yeah, I'll read.
Okay, thank you.
To believe in God means to take for granted that it is man's destiny to rise above brute level of existence and to make himself the agent of justice and mercy. Rejecting the idea of Jewish chosenness. Tradition is very valued. Kaplan's theology was rationalist, but when it came to culture, Kaplan was a pragmatist and appreciated the psychological and social functions of ritual. His view of halakha, the past has a vote, not a veto.
That was, one of his famous sayings. When it comes to like Jewish law, yes, the past has the vote, so maybe the rabbi had a vote too, but not a veto. And the rabbi would be kind of more of a teacher and a guide, but eventually even the Reconstructionist rabbis had to get a little more authority. Otherwise, why invest all that time in becoming a rabbi, I guess. Yeah. So
Rabbi,
let's share some thoughts. Yes,
I have a
please.
question.
Yes.
Why did he, or what is your understanding of why he rejected the whole idea of chosenness?
Chosenness?
I'm not disagreeing with him. I'm just
Yes.
curious.
Well, God can't, if God doesn't act in history, God is not a supernatural power. There's no ability. God doesn't choose. I mean, in order to choose, God has to be an active force in history. And Kaplan's idea was that, well, this Rabbi Julie said, it's not a being, it's a force. So forces don't choose. So the idea of chosenness is very antithetical. I'm not saying agree or disagree, but it's very antithetical to the whole philosophy of Kaplan. It wouldn't fit in at all.
Well,
I
also,
think, yes, go ahead.
Chosenness is really a very, very negative, because it looks bad to the rest of the world if the Jews that are there, the chosen people. And I think that was an important reason why he cast out the idea of
right. I think that Kaplan, part of it has to do with, again, I'm not an expert on Kaplan's thought or Reconstructionism, but I did spend some time leading a Reconstructionist congregation. And I think it has to do also with his idea that, of a democracy, the American way, egalitarianism, right? That you can't say that one people's greater than another. That just wouldn't be the American way. Everyone's equal. It just wasn't rational. And it wasn't, didn't fit his ethics. Yeah. Effie, do you want to say something?
The next time you read the Aleinu prayer in shul, go look at the translation, because that concept of chosenness is all over that prayer.
Right.
I always have a problem with.
So I had been in Reconstructionist. Not only was I at a Reconstructionist congregation, the next congregation I was at used the Reconstructionist prayer book, Kol HaNeshamas, even though it wasn't officially Reconstructionist, but it was felt Reconstructionist. And definitely we did not use the traditional Aleinu prayer, which some people find very objectionable, because it's all about, you've given us this special destiny, we're special. Although, then it goes on to say, so we want the whole world to be repaired and be God's way. You could read a lot of different ways. You don't have to read it as triumphalist, but definitely that rubbed Kaplan the wrong way. He changed that. He changed the prayer when you go up to the Torah. Instead of saying Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Amim, you chose us from all the people, but Kervanu Lavodato, you brought us close to your service, changed it. So we do have that. If anyone wants to say the Reconstructionist version, we have it up there at the Bima, but very seldom do people ask to say that. And Reb Zalman would have little ways of doing that too. Like when he would say, Asher Bahar Banu, instead of Mikol Ha'amim, from all the people, he'd say Im Kol Ha'amim, with all the people, because we're all chosen in our own way, like a different organ of the body. We all have different functions, but we're all of equal value. So I kind of adopted Reb Zalman's. And if you really listen closely to what I say, like when I do the Kiddush, I do say that Im Kol Ha'amim, but it's so subtle, it's hard to catch.
One of the most controversial things, probably the most controversial thing that Kaplan did was eliminate. He attempted, and he actually in the Siddur did it. He eliminated the Kol Nidre prayer, and that yes, exactly that exactly. Well, that was a
bridge too far.
That was a bridge, right? That was a bridge too far, and he had to restate it. But he also had a philosophy of what he called transvaluing things. In other words, you would read stuff like, you just did it with chosen people, which I really like. I never heard that. That's not Kaplan. That's Rabbi Julie, which is very good.
Well, it was Reb Zalman, but
Well, Reb Zalman, I mean, well, that's what Kaplan would have loved that, because what you've done is transvalue chosen to mean chosen within ourselves. So that makes it much more palatable to read it. I mean,
and Reb Zalman had another way to do the Aleinu. He would say, Shelo Asanu and Lo Samanu, you didn't make us, you didn't place us, he would sort of point up and go, lo, for him, God made us for him, for him, for it, for God. And has, you know, it just took out the negative part of it of like, we're not like the other people, we're different. So we could try sometimes doing the other versions and if of the Amida. And I know, I just think in our congregation, it's traditional and people are used to it, the traditional version, and we haven't really explored it very much. So that's interesting. Anyway, that was a big thing. Another thing I think we should mention that Kaplan did is he held the first public bat mitzvah for his daughter, Judith Kaplan, who then later went on to marry his protege, Ira Eisenstein. And she was the first bat mitzvah. And he just decided he had 4 daughters and his daughters should get bar mitzvah just like the boys. So that was
also
important
did a baby naming as well.
Okay, great. So anyway, but let's think about some of his views of God. So his views of God, again, are, you know, a force, a power inside of us moving through. It is actually in history, but it's like a power that's unfolding. That's maybe MLK says, the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. This idea that things actually are evolving in a good direction, which it might be hard to believe it sometimes, but overall you could see that, right? And that's what he believed. And if you look, it's really interesting in the to look at the Reconstructionist prayer books that developed, the newer ones, because they basically try to use verbs to talk about God, right? Like, I don't know if I have one with me. Hold on. Oh, yes, I do. I have my old Reconstructionist prayer book here with all my old Reconstructionist Post-it notes. So they have things like, let's see, because I can find it in the morning blessings, for example. There's this, well, we'll see later, this idea of predicate theology with Harold Schulweis, like not the subject, but the predicate. God is a verb, this kind of thing. Well, let me just find this in the morning blessings. Okay. I just think it'd be interesting for you if you don't mind waiting a moment. It's a very thick book. The Reconstructionists like to do a lot. Okay, the morning blessings, for example, it has, instead of blessed are you, Adonai, our God, it's like blessed are you, and then it has in all capitals, awakener. So now I could relate to God as the awakening power, right? Blessed are you who awakens me in the morning. Blessed are you, the provident God who gives the birds, the ability to distinguish day from night. Blessed are you, the fashioner God, life of the worlds. All these are verbs. Blessed are you, the lamp who makes us see. Blessed are the compassion who clothes the naked. Blessed is the helping hand, the redeeming one. It's all verbs, it's all actions, and it's like actions that we take as God's help and helpers, so to speak, as God's partners. And then again, I told you this is a lovely book of Toba Spitzer, a modern female woman, lesbian rabbi, who talks about a lot about God, finding these kind of images in nature, like God is the rock, God is the well, God is the light, God is listening, God is a cloud. She takes images from Jewish tradition and makes other new ways to relate to God, not in this, the old-fashioned metaphors of like king and father and so on. Okay. So any thoughts about Kaplan's theology? Just does that appeal to you? I mean, maybe are you really a Reconstructionist and you didn't know it, or you didn't know it? That maybe that's a more appealing way of looking at God. It's less supernatural. It's more rationally acceptable. It's kind of gives human beings a bigger role to play. And what do you think about it? I want to hear what you have to think. Yeah, Carol, do you want to say something?
I like it a lot. Maybe I am a Reconstructionist.
I think that a lot of people, a lot of American Jews think like Reconstructionists, even if it is one of the smaller movements, it's had a lot of influence because it's acceptable to people's it's concurrent with a lot of our values and beliefs as modern Jews. And I definitely, when I was in the Reconstructionist movement, I felt a lot of affinity for their beliefs, although I was a little more mystical, maybe when we get to the empiricists and the mystical people. That would be more me. But I once asked Harold Kushner, the author of When Bad Things Happen to Good People, something about his beliefs. We'll get to that later in the course. Just a moment. He talked about how he said, I was an Orthodox Kaplanist. I believed everything, and then I became a little more of a mystic, not in a kind of fundamentalist way, but in a metaphorical way. Like he said that Isaac Luria's idea of the breaking of the vessels, it's not that he believed it literally, but that it was the most compelling metaphor he could find for a lot of the human condition. So we'll come back to that later.
I think that
yes,
Stanley. I think he's onto something. I think the Reconstructionist movement started with a bunch of very, very, very intelligent, intellectual people who rejected the idea of a supernatural God. And one of the famous Kaplan things: you don't have to check your brains out. You don't have to check your brain, before you go into the finger. But the problem that was, and I think it's evolving, is that it has a certain what should I say? It's too intellectual. It loses just what you said. It loses the spiritual, the mystic, the emotional component. And I think what's happened, particularly with the new generations, because I've been around the movement for a very, very long time.
Yeah,
it's evolving to a sort of merger, or maybe not a merger, but it's taken on more and more of what I would call the renewal aspect. The renewal affect, maybe, is a better way to put it. And that's, I think, very good. And I know that in Dr. Rome, one of the premier, Reconstructionist synagogue, we have become more and more musical, more and more touchy-feely, more and more, thinking about the mystical the mystical part of God.
Right.
So it's really. It's really changing.
I think that's true, and all the movements have done that. I think Reform Judaism. There was classical reform. It was very much more formal. There were organs and there were choirs, and now it's become. I mean, the synagogue I grew up in changed a lot. It's become much closer. We've all become a little more closer because, especially post World War II, the State of Israel, these different events have happened that have made the heart and the emotions more valued, I think definitely the Reconstructionism began to be more, it began to be more spiritual, but I would state, I never met Mordecai Kaplan, but I understand he was a very spiritual person. It's just a different kind of spirituality. He had a great love for God and a different view of God. And that also the Reconstructionist movement today is, a lot of it's very extremely progressive politically and relating to Israel and stuff. So a lot of things have changed. So, but anyway, before we go, because it's 8, I want to show you something really fast. We won't do everything I planned for today, but that's okay. It's always good to over plan, So I'd like to tell you about another thing that's, you could say, is rational, which is about Judaism and science. And there's a group I'd like you to know about called Sinai and Synapses. Sinai and Synapses. They have a .org. So if you want to visit sinaiandsynapses.org. One of my colleagues, Jeff Middleman, was a rabbi, founded this group, and they bring together scientists and rabbis and Jewish educators, and they have programs that bring science into synagogues, and at a recent symposium they had with scientists and rabbis, they were talking about some of the intersection between science and theology. So at one point they did start talking about God and how do you relate to God when you're a scientist. So one of the speakers was Rochelle Walensky, former CDC director. And when she's asked about how God relates to science, this is what she said. Somebody will please read this. Do we have a reader?
I'm happy to read.
Thank you.
The biological side, which is when you are doing drug discovery, cellular biology, there's a lot of, this is the how of how this works. This is the how cell divide. This is the how cancer develops. This is the how transmission occurs. And so I think of the sciences, to the how as religion is to the why. Why did God create it this way? Why do cells divide this way? And by asking the why, then maybe there's more. So then, how does that happen? So I sort of see it as this sort of beautiful synergy of the how and the why.
Okay, and this was from a transcript of this panel discussion. That's why it has I sort of this and that. I took out a lot of the sort of kind of likes, but you could see that she, as a physician who's treated, obviously she's been very involved with all medical research, and she's saying that science is about the how, but religion is more about the why. And she does believe in God. She shared that at that panel, even though she's, a scientist, that science and religion are kind of two different realms that go hand in hand for her. And then we'll see another one is Brian Greene. Someone, I got a couple of his books. I got excited about reading his work because I'm sure others of you know a lot more about him, but we were listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson interview him, and he's a physicist. He's a professor of physics and mathematics at Columbia, and he's written popular books explaining all these really far out, things about astrophysics and astronomy to the average person. And so he does not really describe himself as a classical believer. He's like an agnostic or even an atheist. And yet, if you redefine God, he says in that sense, he could believe in God. Like, I didn't bring the famous quotation from Albert Einstein, but I think you've all probably heard it, that he said, that there's a great mystery in the world. There's mystery, there's awesomeness. And when he stands and sees that, in that sense alone, he is a deeply religious person. This saying from Einstein. So it's a little bit like Brian Greene is saying something kind of like that, but he's a contemporary person. Somebody please read this for us. Elsa, you want to read it? Unmute yourself.
Yeah. Okay. Brian Greene, physicist. I think it depends on exactly what one means by that very simple but potent word called God. And so if one means the more literal interpretation, I think many of us have in mind, then I don't see a direct place for that in any of the science that I've ever practiced or that I've ever seen. But if one goes a little bit metaphorical in the interpretation of views God as the remaining mysteries, or as the wonder that it all just seems to fit together, the elegance of the mathematical description, the capacity of a few symbols on a blackboard to make predictions about temperature variations, and the microwave background radiation that was released 388,000 years after the Big Bang. And then we build these space telescopes and we measure the temperature in space, and it agrees with the mathematical, the awe and the wonder that comes from that insight. Sure, I feel that I'm resonant with the kinds of feelings that I believe you make reference to when you invoke these words.
Okay. So here you have someone who would not describe himself as a believer, but he is Jewish. These people are all Jewish. And, saying much like Einstein, like when it comes to the awe and the wonder and the discovery and the mystery, that is how I could say, if you call that God, I can get on board with that, I guess. Even though he went on to say that, like, when he's explaining the physical world, all he needs is the physical. Not a lot of physicists, as they start looking at like subatomic, what do you call it? Particle physics, subatomic particles. There's so many things that get almost to be mystical, and some of them become a bit of mystics. And here's another physicist. This was in another post for Sinai and Synapses. Pekka Sinervo, PhD, a physicist. Pamela, I saw you were raising your hand. Do you want to read this last one here?
Sure. Mm-hmm. My God is not the God that thunders down from Mount Sinai, killing the many thousands of Jews who participated in making the idol of the golden calf. My God is not the God that sits benevolently, listening and responding to me when I pray. My God is not the God that defines what is good and evil in our world. My God is that ineffable being or essence that must suffuse our world and make it just so, make it a world that continues to fill me with awe. It is the God that somehow, just don't ask me how, has had a role in defining what the world around me looks like, that has allowed those emotions in me that bring me to this love, or bring me to love those around me, that compels me to love this world, to leave this world a better place than when I found it. Okay. That's beautiful.
Yeah, so there you have three different scientists talking about the way they see God, right? You had first a physician saying, well, science is the how, religion is the why, God is the why. You have another physicist, astrophysicist saying, you know, if you want to define God as the mystery, the awe, then I could be on board with that. And then you have some, saying, yes, I don't believe in those classic old ideas. I don't really relate to God that way, but let's see if I can summarize, again, I think it's the awe, the essence that makes the world just so, and somehow has had a role in making me be who I am. Kind of as the Psalms say, has the one who planted the ear, does the one who planted the ear not hear? Does the one who planted the eye not see? Isn't he so much greater than us? So I hope maybe you come away from this evening with some new ideas that there are different ways to look at God while being Jewish, or even fitting into Jewish frameworks that have to do with something in our rational faculties, even if it's not totally like a rational proof of God like people did in the Middle Ages. And but the idea that you don't have to divine God in a supernatural way. You could see God more as a force or an unfolding power that is within us rather than something outside of us. You could see God, as part of the mystery, as you as a scientist or as any other person learning would discover dimensions of God. So I think all of those are different ways to see God, and that we'll come back, I think, next time in a month, which is going to be the 4th. It's going to be the 4th Tuesday because of Passover, right? Yeah. It'll be on the 22nd, so it'll be after Passover, but it'll be about empiricism or the mysticism, which is, kind of like more what I like, the touchy-feely. Who said that? Right? Stanley said, I'm more into that touchy-feely, mystical, woo-woo stuff. So that'll be me. I'm excited about that. And we'll still look at how different people combine these different things. We'll look at Neil Gaiman's personal theology. We'll look at later, the next one will be existentialism. So we'll look next time like Rabbi Heschel, Rabbi Reb Zalman, and I'm trying to bring in more women thinkers. So maybe Malila Helner Eshed, Israeli scholar, and some of the existential thinkers in Judaism the next time with, Buber, Schulweiss, and I just think it's going to be Joseph Soloveitchik. So I hope it'll be really interesting. And finally, I'm leaving for last this whole thing we struggle with, of course, but if we believe in God, then how do we explain why God lets these things happen So all those things are important. I'm looking forward to them, and thank you for being here. Okay.
Yeah, All
right. I'm good.